So most of you already know me. I'm from Norway. I'm a single guy, no children. I have a background as a web developer, and I was working for 4.5 years in student ministry in Malmö. And I'm currently attending Bible school in my hometown. So this is an overview of what we are going to do. This is the introduction, and I will go right into the presentation after that. There will be a room for input from you guys with Blair first. And then I will say what the next steps in my vision will be. And I'll have some words about the starter crew I'm wanting to raise up. And at the end, there will be a question and answer section for any questions. And yeah. And I think we will be finished by maybe 1930. That depends a little bit on how many questions and how much input you guys have. So I'm gonna start with my testimony. About 20 to 25 years ago, I was attending the university in Trondheim. It's a scary thought because that means I'm starting to get really old. I was a rather lonely student. It was I didn't seek out my fellow students because I was rather shy, still shy, and I was curious about whatever Christian presence there was on the campus, but as far as I remember, I didn't see any Christian presence on the campus at all. I only saw some posters about the Lage, the Norwegian IFES, that they had some activities on the bigger campus areas. But on the campus I was attending most of the time, there was nothing of it at all. At the same time, most of the typical activities that would be typical for reaching out to students would not really work that easily with me, because if they had a waffle table, I would always think, I'm just gonna let someone else get those waffles, because I don't really need the waffles as much as the other people. So I was. It would be really difficult to get to speak with me, because I wouldn't go to the stands. And when I started doing a student ministry myself, I was actually once asking myself, how would I have reached a guy like me? And I realized that there's no way I as a student ministry worker would be able to reach myself. The only ones that could have reached me would be my fellow students, people that would see me, spend time with me, talk with me, maybe from the study groups, or in different contexts would interact with me. Those are the people that actually would be able to have seen me and brought me closer to Christ if the right person had been there. But there was no such person at all. And I was really ripe for the harvest. I believe there's a lot of other people that are just like me back then and at these days as well. There are many students that are maybe considering themselves curious about Christianity, or they are maybe even wanting to be Christian, but they have questions, but they have no one to speak to. And they don't feel comfortable seeking someone out to get those answers. They need someone to come to them. And that is why I think this Bible verse from Matthew 9:36 to 38 is very important. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion with them. I need to just because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." And I feel like one of the biggest harvest fields we can somewhat easily access today in the Nordic countries, it is the field of student ministry. There are so many students that may be curious and very curious about what the Christians believe in. Fast forward to when I finally had been saved. God found a way still. I got involved with a local church and their student ministry. And through that ministry, I caught a vision for the student ministry. And some years later, in November 2015, I moved to Malmö and was pioneering with this great team you're seeing on the screen now. A year or two into the ministry, I realized how important the full-time workers were. The students came repeatedly to me and said how thankful they were that I was there to keep the wheels going when they were too busy to do anything themselves. And when they had time, I would let them get the space they needed to teach each other about the topics on their heart. And I really felt that I was a enabler. So I helped them organize this event that we called Burning the Book, an academic approach to the Bible on its own terms. This was an event that the students took an initiative to. And my role was just to help them to do the things they could not do, to drive around the coffee they needed for the event, all the things, practical things that they could not do. And I was, they planned most of the event themselves. And my role was really that of an enabler. So I believe that as student ministry workers, role is really to be enabling students to find a way to be visible as Christians on the campus. Some of our girls didn't know about other Christians until they had fika to go, coffee to go on the campus, and inviting their classmates to come and get some free coffee. And all of a sudden they had found, oh, there's a Christian girl here. And another thing is to enable them to find new ways to reach the fellow students with the gospel. So a conclusion of this first part is that we need ministry workers that work either part-time or full-time with student ministry. To expect the students to do all the work themselves is to expect them to either have to study a little bit slower so they can actually spend the time they need to work, or you may find them overworking themselves. So expecting a full-time student to also work be the main workers of a student ministry, that may you need the very right people to do that effectively, and you won't find them very often. Parallel with my adventure into the ministry in Malmö, I did encounter many different practical problems. For example, how am I going to do this thing with taxes? How much do I need to pay tax? And all that kind of just so many questions. I encountered the challenge of churches that could not support me directly, as it would count as salary, and they couldn't afford the extra expense. So that was another challenge, getting enough finance was also a challenging thing, and also how to deal with the practical ministry expenses, like going to connect, going for conferences, national conferences, buy literature, and so on. Because I could not really find a way where I could deduct it from my income. So I actually had to pay tax of the money that I used for paying those expenses, which is not a sustainable thing in the long run, in my opinion. And there were other challenges at the practical level as well. So that kind of got me started thinking of having some sort of organization that could respond to those challenges and answer those challenges in some way. My main thought was the practical things and the funds. But when I was starting to consider what kind of financing model would an organization have, I was considering the different models that are traditional in Scandinavia. The Pentecostal unions, at least in Norway and Sweden. I'm not completely sure how it is done in Denmark or Finland, but in Pentecostal churches in Norway and Sweden, it seems to me that the most missionaries are employed by one church, but they are usually supported by several churches that pay to that employing church. The other traditional model of missions financing in the Nordic countries would be missions association. In Norway, we have several of them. I don't know the number of them, but there are many. And there may also be some other traditional models too, but the mission association and the church employment models are the most biggest ones, I believe. And I was considering those until I realized something about what I call the American model, because the way of missionaries raising funds privately from friends and churches in a way that is done in the US, it is not very common in Norway. I think the main player in Scandinavia that is doing that would be Viven. And I actually realized that we actually need to go for that kind of model for this organization as well, because the important thing that we really need to build in Scandinavia, even before we think of workers, even before we think of finances, it is a vision for student ministry. And I feel that today the vision work that have been done in churches in Scandinavia is mostly focused on church leaders. But not so much among the average church attendance. I even saw, I could speak with people in the last summer. I was in Malmö, and oh, you do student ministry here in Malmö? And that was the church members. So that made me very aware that we need to be visible to the church at large in Scandinavia. We need to be sort of selling student ministry to many in all the ways we can think of. We need to write in Christian newspapers. We need to make YouTube channels. We need to try all the ways we can to just promote and make an awareness of the need for student ministry in the Nordic countries. I didn't really like the idea that I had that we would have to have all this vision work, because I would rather have someone else do the fundraising, like in missions association, and me just concentrate on doing the student ministry itself. But even then, I did remember that back in the days, it was very common that the missionaries, when they did come home to Norway, they would be traveling around and they would tell all about the lives as missionaries in the countries that they came from. So that is why we really need a vision worker as well. Someone once told me that I think it was from YWAM, that the 20% of your ministry time on the field should be used to follow up your financial supporters and prayer supporters. That is a visionary task. You're telling about the work you're doing, and you are making them aware of the need for student ministry. In the American models, they are also spend every 5th year back in the state to renew the funding and to spread the vision for missions. And in the case of SFC workers, to spread the vision for student ministry in Europe. And if you add those numbers together, you actually get a 36% more than 1/3 of the time is supposed to be spent on creating a spreading a vision for student ministry. So we do need workers to create a much stronger vision for and awareness for student ministry in the Nordic countries. So the vision we have is not the vision that the Marvel Universe would like to have, but we have a vision to see all the campuses of the Nordic countries to have strong, Christ-centered and viable student ministries. With strong, we mean active, They are established, and they are well organized and supported by national organization, probably. Christ-centered means they are always reaching out to Christians and non-believers alike. They are discipling their members, and they are true witnesses of Jesus on the campus. And with viable, I mean that they have found good ways to recruit new members. They have ministry workers, and they keep getting new workers as well. And they keep a continuity across the many student generations, because a student generation lasts for maybe 3 years if you're and if you're lucky, you may have a student for 5 years or 6 years. So why am I focusing on the Nordic countries and not on a specific country or for the whole of Europe? And the main reason is that the Nordic countries, they are very similar. They have very similar cultures and mindsets. The picture we are seeing on the side here is a very good example of that in these Corona days. It says, these new social distancing rules are crazy. We have to stand 2 meters apart. And the answer is, I know. What do they want to stand closer together than normal? So the culture is very similar in all the Nordic countries. It's not just a very Finnish problem as the picture is claiming. We have the same thing in Norway, in Sweden, and even Denmark would claim the same thing. And that's an odd thing for northerners like us in Finland, Norway, and Sweden, because we are thinking of the Danes as the Mediterraneans of the Nordic countries. We also have a very similar flavor of secularism, and the laws and employment conditions are quite similar as well. And even the languages are quite similar. Even when dealing with Finland, if I'm gonna have to look up a law in Finland, I just need to find the Swedish version of it, and I can read that. I don't need to learn Finnish. Yay! And the most difficult country for me to read the languages of would be actually Iceland, because they are a little bit backwards when it comes to the grammar and stuff. But it would be cool to sort of feel like I'm learning to speak the Viking language. So the suggested tasks for an organization, I'm saying suggested because both the vision and the task list I'm coming here, they are what I suggest. What we actually would need to do is that the startup crew would actually need to make a vision document and mission document and strategy document, and to try to figure out how are we actually going to work as an organization. But this is the things I have suggested. We would work with the awareness and vision for student ministry. We would create employment models for ministry workers. Should they be employed by the churches? Should they be employed by an organization? That's open to discussion. And then they may be different for different countries as well. It would also be to help with practical matters, to ask questions about how do you deal with taxes? How do you deal with missionaries from another country, either in the Nordic community or maybe from EU or from the US, because all those people, when they come, they will have questions. How do we do this? And instead of having separate churches and individual workers learn it on their own every single time, it is better to have one place where we gather that knowledge and we can give it to the next one from the same place, and we can keep it updated as needed. The organization could also be a contact point between churches and prospective workers. And the organization could work strategically to find ways to reach vision to reach all the campuses. It could mean working with other student networks for trying to get a full coverage without necessarily having overlaps many places. And last but not least, the organization would work actively on recruiting workers. And one thing I have been thinking that this organization could work on would be actually creating a vision for student ministry in the people that are becoming students in a year or 2 or 3 years. So basically those attending the high school level. They need to, if they don't have a vision by the end of their high school, it may be too late in many cases. Because if they don't find a student ministry, they won't catch the vision. So a couple of important things to take note about this organization. It is not meant to be an SFC equivalent for the Nordic countries. This organization will rather be sort of AG missions equivalent for the Nordic countries. The AG missions is the organization that formally do the support raising in the US. Brekan can correct me if I'm wrong about that. I also believe they may be the official employer of the missionaries. The organization will not be focusing on how to do student ministry, but rather on how to get and keep the ministry workers. A problem, I'm not the first Nordic worker or Norwegian student ministry worker. Some of you know Lina. She was for a short time in Sweden before she moved back to Norway. And I know that she did struggle with making it viable long term to be a student ministry worker. And I believe that is because we are lacking the structures needed to support the student ministry workers. One question that I have been asked from before is why create an organization before we have workers? And it is about making it easier to become a student ministry worker, and to make it easier to be a student ministry worker, to answer all those technical or practical challenges earlier, because I could have maybe raised a couple of more thousands if I could have had some sort of organization that would be my employer, at least some kind of organization that would have been an employer. That it would also mean that I probably would have to raise a little bit more, but it would be easier to find more instances of people that and churches that could support me. There were at least one church in Germany that actually wanted to support student ministry in Malmö, but we had no way to route money for them, and that is also why I feel we need some sort of organization where it can be done. It is also a question about what came first of the chicken and the egg. And my answer to that is it clearly must be the chicken. And you may ask, where did the chicken come from? Well, God created the first chicken. If God created the first egg, well, who would be hatching that egg? We need someone to keep that egg warm. We need someone to do all the things a hen would be doing for their eggs. And when the chicks come out of the egg, we need someone that can help those chicks to feed and protect them from dangers. And that is why I feel we need to create this chicken for all those prospective student ministry workers, because I saw how difficult it was, not only for me in the Malmö team. I saw the problems that Marian Mika had practically. I saw the problems that all the others in the team had, for different problems because they came from different places, but they all had different challenges in student ministry, and some of those could actually have been alleviated if we had a structure to deal with those things. And they all had to figure out how to do it on their own, because we don't have any structure to have that knowledge. And the knowledge they did gain to a certain degree is lost because we haven't had a way to keep and assimilate that information that they gained. So the next steps are, first of all, to start up this group I call the startup crew or the startup group. That group will start on visiting the vision I have started with, maybe refining that or changing it out for another one. And it will also look at the actual tasks and basically make a document with mission statements for what this organization will do. And finally, also collect a collection of strategies for how we want to do achieve the goal as well. I think that is a fundamental thing before we can do all the practical stuff of creating the organization. The next step would be actually to decide on what kind of organizational form. Should it be an association? Should it be a non-profit stock company? Should it be some other kind of organization form? And every organizational form have their advantages and disadvantages as well. There's also a question of what country should the organization be based from. It's not self-evident that since I'm doing this, it should be in Norway. I would actually think it would be better to have it in Sweden or Denmark, because both of those countries are kind of a little bit more central to the whole Nordic cluster of countries. And that includes Iceland as well. After having chosen the form and the country, we will need to look at the bylaw requirements to create the constitution of the organization, and there may be different requirements depending on the organizational form. And then it's the work of actually creating the bylaws, which means take whatever templates exist and fill out what we feel need to be added. And it may also be preparing documents for the funding meeting itself, because I would believe we would need to create the first budget. We would need to create probably a timeline or some activities to concentrate on during the first year. It would be to recruit the members for the actual first board. This startup group it's not a board by itself. This organization doesn't exist until we have founded the organization itself. So there are some requirements before we can do that, but we will need eventually need board members for most of the organizational structures we can choose between. And we also need that just to do the work of the organization as well. So what would I expect from the startup crew? They would need to participate in meetings. The first few meetings focusing on the vision and mission and strategies would be the most involved, and those would probably be the long meetings. Then I think once that is done, we would probably meet something like once or twice a month to just check in and see that we have progress. And there will also be a job of just finding and recruiting the potential board members. How long this commitment would take, it could be 6 months, it could be a year, perhaps longer. That is also why this group may add members if needed, and we can try to add more members depending on how we see the workload is acting like.